The situation for Ukraine is truly spiraling out of control. What once was the hope of the Great White West, should we say the Great White Whale of the collective West, to conquer the Russian bear, to essentially put Russia down, keep it down forever. That effort has not just been a failure, but now has transformed into something quite different. It has become a defeat for both Ukraine and the collective West as a whole. This conflict has spiraled out of control. Russia's advantages have become too obvious to avoid and to ignore. But now there is a great awakening, so to speak, that we've seen in the Western mainstream media, trying to cover the tracks of the neocons and the warmongers who provoked and then attempted to push this conflict into a state of permanence in an attempt not just to satisfy the interests of the profiteers of war, like the military industrial complex, but also to satisfy the aims of those neocons who see Russia's defeat not as a short-term possibility, but a long-term objective. Nonetheless, all of it has been laid to ruin. So here you have the Financial Times with breaking news, they say. Here's its post on X. The White House has issued a warning that the U.S. will run out of funds to Ukraine by the end of the year. Here's Alan McLeod, a great journalist over at Press, with the meme of Zelensky being dropped by Biden, like in Toy Story. I don't want to play with you anymore. Now, this is actually quite serious because it's not just the Biden administration. It is also those forces like neocon Lindsey Graham, which had once been so enthusiastic for Ukraine, now pivoting because of the situation being so grim. Here is what Lindsey Graham had to say about on State of the Union at CNN, what he had to say about Ukraine's future in terms of funding.
So I will not vote for any aid until we secure our own border. Reform asylum, reform parole is possible to do. Democrats don't want to do it. All Republicans want to do it. I'm not helping Ukraine until we help ourselves. So I will not.
Okay, I just want to say one thing. Dana Bash here literally looks like the Joker. That's not. It's not about like. I mean, I just can't help but make this comment, especially at the end here. I mean, Dana Bash just looks like the Joker. I just had to say it. Sorry if that offends anybody, but so nonetheless, that's just the beginning of it, because you have this funding bill in Congress that's not going through. Nobody's voting on it. Joe Biden's all on his own, and I'm going to show you how lonely he really is very soon. But you also have Ukraine. You have the neocons like Lindsey Graham, and then you have Ukraine. Zelensky's top ed says high risk of defeat coming. Andrei Yermak has called for more funds for Kiev as Congress remains at loggerhead. Zelensky's chief of staff admits that there is a big risk that Ukraine will lose its conflict with Russia unless U.S. Congress approves the $100 billion that's supposed to be for Kiev, or Israel, and Taiwan. Republican lawmakers are adamant that they will not approve the spending unless Democrats compromise on the southern border security issue. Yermak made the case for more funding during an appearance at the U.S. Institute for Peace, a Washington-based think tank. He claimed, yes, which is a literal U.S. government think tank, he claimed that his country had inflicted casualties on Russia's forces at a ratio of 1 to 10. It was capable of defeating on the battlefield in the long run. But he admitted the delay in the provision of aid could pose a challenge for Ukraine. It would give the big risk that we can be in the same position where we can be in the same position where we are located now. Of course, it's a very high possibility, impossible to continue to liberate and give the big risk to lose the war. So, of course, there's some translation issues there. But nonetheless, first of all, Yermak is a complete and utter liar. It is not a 10-to-1 ratio. Give me a break. Ukraine is running out of men, and you have, it is quite obvious. Media Zona, the Pussy Riot tracker of Russia's casualties, there is no comparing. We went over this in the program before, but nonetheless, he is admitting, even if it is with some consternation and with some propaganda, that they are potentially going to lose. So, and it gets worse, okay? So I'm going to show you a few things. So here you have the Washington Post saying that the Ukraine had ignored US's counteroffensive strategy, said the Washington Post. And over a dozen Post employees interviewed more than 30 senior officials from Ukraine, the US, and the EU. Only a handful identified by name. The conclusion was that a counteroffensive born in optimism has failed to deliver its expected punch, generating friction and second guessing between Washington and Kiev. And this is Washington. This is the United States, the neocons throwing Ukraine under the bus, because that's what the United States does. This is what happens when you get in bed with Uncle Sam. You will not be happy. It's not going to be a long-term relationship. You're going to get dumped. And worse yet, you may lose a lot from it. And that is exactly what has happened. But I want to show you now the Washington Post article quickly here. So this is the Post article. Okay, this is the map. And this is the title: Miscalculations, Divisions Marked Offensive Planning by the U.S. and Ukraine. And here you have a map. And this is what I think is most important. I'll go over some of these points. So here's what they're saying. They say that Ukraine wanted to attack with its forces at 3 distinct points along the 600-mile front line here. And there you have the arrows to Bakhmut, through the Zaporozhye province to the land bridge, and then Melitopol. While the U.S. had urged the bulk of the forces, you see this darker arrow ever so slightly, should be focused on one axis toward Melitopol. So here's what they had to say in terms of the key elements that shaped the outcome of the counteroffensive. Ukrainian, U.S., and British officers held 8 major tabletop war games to build a campaign plan, but Washington miscalculated the extent to which Ukraine's forces could be transformed into a Western-style fighting force in a short period, especially without giving Kiev air power integral to modern militaries. So that sounds like you're blaming yourself a bit while blaming Ukraine, huh? U.S. and Ukrainian officials sharply disagreed at times over strategy, tactics, and timing. The Pentagon wanted the assault to begin in mid-April to prevent Russia from continuing to strengthen its lines. The Ukrainians hesitated, insisting they weren't ready without additional weapons and training. So what this sounds like is that Ukraine didn't want to just throw themselves into the slaughter, although they ended up doing so. The Ukrainian government threw all of its forces into the slaughter. But the United States wanted it done even quicker. Doesn't sound out of the question for the United States. U.S. military officials were confident that a mechanized frontal attack on Russian lines were feasible with troops and weapons that Ukraine had. The simulations concluded Kiev's forces, in the best case, could reach the Sea of Azov and cut off Russian troops in 60 to 90 days. The United States advocated a focused assault on the southern axis, but Ukraine's leadership believed its forces had to attack 3 distinct points on the 600-mile front, which I just showed you. The intelligence community had a more downbeat view than the U.S. military, assessing the offensive had only a 50-50 chance of success given the stout multi-layered defenses Russia had built up over the winter and spring. So, not even agreement within the DC neocon apparatus. Many in Ukraine and the West underestimated Russia's ability to rebound from battlefield disasters and exploit its perennial strengths, manpower, minds, and a willingness to sacrifice lives on a scale that few other countries countenance. Again, BS, because Russia has been fighting a war of attrition to protect its soldiers. And let's be honest here, the casualties for Ukraine have dwarfed that of Russia by many fold. So, as the expected launch of the offensive approach, Ukrainian military officials feared they would suffer catastrophic losses, while American officials believed the toll would ultimately be higher without a decisive assault. Nonetheless, regardless of no one seems to be right in this situation, but this shows the kind of dirty laundry that they are trying to clean up now after the mess has been made. It is not working, and it has sown huge rifts. And here's just a few of them. Okay, you have Zelensky abruptly canceling a U.S. Senate briefing, so he didn't go, which is a pretty big deal because he is a puppet. But he didn't end up going because the Senate, of course, was not going to pass anything, and he would have been wasting his time. And then you also have the fact that here's the Kiev Post talking about Zelensky, and 17 million shells report alleges rift between Ukraine's leaders. Zelensky's alleged complaints about Zelensky's office and his unusual request to the Pentagon chief indicate a rift between Ukraine's civilian and military leaders, according to the Ukrainska Pravda source. In a meeting, so here's where the tensions are. In a meeting with Lloyd Austin, Defense Department Chief of the United States, on November 20th, Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine, Valery Zelensky, allegedly said that he requires 17 million shells and 350 to 400 billion in forces and funds to achieve the goal of liberating Ukraine. The anonymous source cited in the UP article, The War Against Politics, What is Really Going On Between Zelensky and Zelensky, said Austin was surprised at, to put it mildly, because there are not that many shells in the whole world. Additionally, the source claimed that Zelensky complained to Austin about interference from the president's office. The source said, well, it's clear the president also found out about such conversations, and they don't promote trust. So nonetheless, here you have Zelensky absolutely out of his mind, and you have Zelensky all, trying to interfere. In what way, we don't know. But we know that there are rifts, and we've known this for quite a while. So I'm going to put on the folks of the Duran to react to this, because I think it's important. They're going to talk about the power struggle, because it really does point to a very grim future for Ukraine and Zelensky in particular. So here we go.
Happening in Ukraine, it looks like you have Zelensky and his team, Zelensky, Podolyak, Yermak on one side. It seems like you have Zelensky, I would say Klitschko now, perhaps Poroshenko, and some other oligarchs, perhaps, on the Zelensky military side. And then you also have the Budanov SPU intel, which it's hard to say where exactly they're tilting towards. You had this poisoning incident of Mariana Budanov, and perhaps the Budanov is just kind of sitting back and waiting to see what happens. Maybe he wants to seize power. Who knows? But something is happening in Ukraine. Maybe we won't have a coup or a Maidan 3. Maybe Zelensky will get certain intel from Budanov, and he'll be able to prevent something like that happening. But I think it's pretty safe to say now that plots are being hatched.
Plots are being hatched, and they are clearly moving to some kind of,
I just want to say I'm glad I'm not the only one that has problems with sirens. Just going to put that out there.
An event, some kind of a showdown. Now, can I just say, of course, it's very interesting that Arestovich talks about Maidan 3 as an alternative to a coup. Most people would say that Maidan 2 was a coup. But anyway, there we go. I mean, I'm just saying. I mean, how do you remove from office against his will a constitutionally elected president and claim that this is not a coup? I mean, it's presumably some sort of a coup. I mean, he's not suggesting, as far as I can tell, an impeachment process, which apparently the Ukrainian system would make extremely difficult. So one way or the other, what Arestovich is talking about is a coup, either a coup, which is the normal classical coup, troops on the streets.
So this is in reference to Alexei Arestovich has continued to make comments about the political tensions that I have mentioned earlier that the Kiev Post reported on, but not fully.
Police people rounding up prisoners, that kind of thing, the kind of coup that we're familiar with from Latin America and other places. Or alternatively, he's talking about another kind of coup, protests in the streets, squares being occupied, that kind of thing. But
I think that's the distinction. Yeah,
that's the distinction.
That's the distinction he's trying to make. Yeah, exactly. Whether it's military guys or whether it's going to be people on Maidan Square.
Exactly. And by the way, we are already seeing small protests so far, but they are growing in Kiev. They're there all the time. Even the British media is picking them up now. People are demanding rotation of their loved ones who are in the army and that kind of thing. And they're apparently appearing on the Kiev subway, all kinds of things of that kind. But put that aside, let's not talk about the mechanics of this. It's absolutely clear that there is now a growing movement within the Ukrainian political military leadership
to try to get Zelensky out. And they're all of them looking for ways to do it. They haven't yet settled on a way.
I mean, look at if Zelensky is saying there's interference from the president's office on helping to liberate Ukraine, meanwhile making maybe more drugged out kind of claims or requests to the United States, 350 to 400 billion, almost half of the entire military budget of the open, or at least public military budget of the United States in just shells alone. Regardless, to throw Zelensky under the bus like that, to essentially your paymaster, Lloyd Austin, one of the biggest ones, is a pretty grave indication that there are plots and plans to undermine Zelensky's position.
And Zelensky is very well aware of this, and he wants to remain where he is. You've had his wife saying that she doesn't want him to stay as president for another term, which you could argue is that she's trying to persuade her husband to bend to all this pressure, to step down. I mean, that's what it looked like to me. But Zelensky himself appears determined to stay. I think the people around him, people like Yermak, Podolyak, and the others, also obviously want him to stay. And a couple of days ago, Zelensky went on this very strange and mysterious tour of the various military people on the front lines. He went to Kherson, he went to Kupiansk, he met with all the generals. He came back and made an announcement about Ukraine building fortifications. It was all very muddled and not entirely clear, but it looked as if he was saying that Ukraine is going to go onto the defensive from this point on. My own sense is that he was going to the military, trying to shore up support with them, and that he didn't speak to Zelensky, who's clearly he sees, and probably rightly, as one of the key plotters. But my impression was that what he was doing was telling the military, look, back me. What is your price? And the military said, look, the soldiers, the generals said, look, if you want us to back you, the minimum thing you have to do is to stop these offensives, these attacks. Let us go on the defensive. We're just frittering away our resources by doing that.
Which is happening, which just happened in Marianka, I believe it was. It's happening in Avdiivka. They are retreating more and more. They're not going on the offensive anymore. The Western mainstream media is talking about war of attrition for the Ukraine side for the last several months. This shows that indeed this is not just about external forces, but there's a lot of internal turmoil. Of course there would be, given the grave consequences that the way this conflict has been fought for Ukraine. I mean, this is what happens when you get in bed with Uncle Sam.
So Zelensky, who up to this point has insisted on attacks being conducted on every part of the front lines, went back to Kiev after meeting these military people, and as part of whatever deal or attempted deal he tried to close with them, agreed that Ukraine is on the defensive from this point on and is going to try and build fortified lines. More difficult to do, by the way, than say, but that is what it looked like to me. Of course, whatever deal Zelensky thinks he's cut with the generals might not really be a deal at all in their eyes. We'll just have to see how it all plays out. But clearly, lots of things are going on. You get rumors swirling around. You have MPs from Zelensky's party sniping all the time at Zelensky. There's clear indications that Zelensky wants to sack Zelensky because he clearly sees Zelensky as the chief plotter. You also get rumors and speculations about what Zelensky himself is up to. Zelensky's keeping very, very quiet. He wasn't at this meeting with the other generals. And there's been reports of telephone conversations between Poroshenko and the former president, who's also an oligarch, and another big Ukrainian oligarch Rinat Akhmetov, who I believe is not physically in Ukraine at the moment. But anyway, lots of things moving on. The chessboard is moving. And clearly, there is within Kiev now a consensus amongst perhaps the predominant bloc within the Ukrainian establishment that Zelensky has to go.
Zelensky has to go. I mean, this is what we've been saying here on this program for quite a long time, that this was what was going to happen, that the rudiments of this are being built up, the foundations for Zelensky's ultimate ouster are coming. The United States has intimated a real interest in elections in Ukraine. You heard the Alexander Mercouris talk about these oligarchs maneuvering maybe into a political role and having strong communication with pretty major forces in the Ukrainian political establishment at this time. So we're going to see, I think, a realignment over time. Zelensky is going to be more isolated because what's happening is the conflict has changed course entirely. This is no longer the conflict that NATO had set out for itself in the beginning. This is no longer the conflict that Ukrainian leadership under Zelensky had willfully parroted on behalf of NATO and the United States at the beginning of February 2022. This is now a conflict on Russia's terms. And given that, there has to be a new realignment, a new orientation to save face and to stabilize whatever can be stabilized for the future of the conflict. Because no doubt, people like Zelensky do not want to give up on the fight. They want the fight to go on, to benefit them, to benefit their position. This is what happens to coup governments. I've always called Ukraine a coup government, not because there's an absence of elections. Because you're a coup government does not mean there's an absence of elections. This is the narrow thinking of an ignorant collective West, of an ignorant population in the collective West. No, coup governments just mean that they are governments produced by a coup. If you hold elections a couple of years later, it doesn't mean that government is not a coup government, because who administers the elections? Those who participated in ultimately waged the coup. You literally have Poroshenko trying to make a revival that wouldn't happen if there was truly, quote unquote, democracy in Ukraine. You also wouldn't have the re-legitimization and the outright celebration of the worst forces of World War II, those NAZIs that, of course, made up a huge bulk of the impetus and the motivation for the conflict with Russia. So all of this is to say is that this was always going to end really badly, because we don't have a story in history where governments that are outcomes of coups, especially foreign-backed coups, U.S.-backed coups, Western-backed coups. We don't have a long history of those governments being stable, being successful. We can go all over the African continent, all over Latin America, all over Asia. And every time a coup has happened, instability, chaos, and ultimately the demise of that government in some way, shape, or form occurs. That's what happens because they are not legitimate. They are simply battering rams for a larger political and economic agenda, generally led by the United States and the collective West at this time, and especially over the last 70 or so years since the end of World War II. So Zelensky finds himself in a complete and utter dangerous position, utterly dangerous position, one in which may not be salvageable. Zelensky is likely going to have to go. We don't know how it's going to happen. Will he fall slain somehow, poisoned? Will he be killed outright? That is not an impossibility. Will he be elected out? Will he be overthrown? Will there be a Maidan redux? We don't know. But what we do know is that because the conflict in Ukraine has changed, because Russia has won, Ukraine now, with the, if we can call it, aid from the United States and the collective West, are going to have to put back the pieces together in some way, shape, or form to realign, readjust, and move forward. Because as I always say on this program, the objective to target Russia, to destroy Russia is not over. It is just that the Ukraine project, the Project Ukraine, as some call it, is essentially over in terms of its ability to achieve its intended objectives. The fighting may continue. More people may die on all sides. Ukraine will deteriorate and disintegrate in many various ways in the very near future. But nonetheless, what we are going to see is patchwork. We're going to see instability and chaos, and we're going to see the end of Zelensky very soon. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.